Hello, my name is Andy Versosa. Today we present the third program in a series of 7, When Two Worlds Met Through European Eyes, curated by Gail White Usher. This program will examine some of the surviving written records of European early encounters with North America's indigenous peoples. Gail will use accounts, journal entries, letters, publications, images, and other documents to understand the objectives and rationale of European actions during early colonization. These original materials revealed the perspectives of the early European colonizers and provide insight into how this perspective influenced their actions. Before we start further, I'd like to read our land acknowledgement. We at Stanley-Whitman House acknowledge that we are situated in the homeland of the Tunxis people, who later invited the Mohegan, Wangunk, Quinnipiac, and other displaced Native people to join them here. Today, 5 nations, the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Shaktookook, and Golden Hill Pagusset, and the descendants of other Native peoples continue to serve as stewards of this land. With this acknowledgement, we recognize the legacies of settler colonialism, and we signal ongoing commitment to building relationships with the indigenous communities who have lived on these ancestral lands for almost 15,000 years and to the future nations. Stanley-Whitman House is committed to recognizing, celebrating, and learning from the profound cultures, histories, and perspectives of indigenous peoples. I'm delighted to have Gail White Usher present tonight. Gail is a distinguished educator and researcher specializing in New England's early history, where their insights centering on the intricate relationships between Native American and European immigrant women in the 17th and early 18th centuries. Her fascination with the dynamic interactions between these two worlds will certainly foster enriching conversations. Gail's extensive knowledge and unique perspective are grounded in her roles as the education coordinator for Historic New England, chair of the Woodstock Historic District Commission, and president of Chamberlain Mill. So without further ado, I want to thank you for joining us, everyone who's watching our program. Let's warmly welcome Gail White Usher. Thank you, and it's all yours, Gail.
Thank you. Thank you, Andy. Thank you very much for the continuing invitation to be able to speak with everyone. I'm speaking to you from land that has been the home to humans for at least 13,000 years. For at least the past 3,000 years, it's been home of the Nipmuc peoples. And for the last 1,000 years, the land has been home to the Wapquasit people, members of the Nipmuc Nation. Now the land is home to people from all over the world. Let me just share this. Again, thank you all. And today's program is Through European Eyes. Now, I've never given this presentation through European eyes the same way twice. I constantly am identifying new material that informs on the thesis and on the intent of the intent of my presentation changes. The historical period, 1600 to 1780, is primarily documented from one perspective. European views dominate. Here and there, especially later in the period, elusive indigenous voices can be glimpsed. The scholar must constantly reassemble the picture of this period of great change, like building a mosaic from tiny pieces with new pieces constantly being introduced. The volume of surviving material is significant. Accounts, documents, town records, reports, advertisements, publications, paintings, sketches, prints, and much more. In many cases, this material was created with specific intent to achieve a specific result, and or from a position of significant bias. We will examine my curated selections today of original material that have been assembled for this particular program, with the goal of gaining a clear understanding of European attitudes and observations of the indigenous peoples of Northeast North America in the period 1600 to the 1780s. I'm going to let the excerpts that I'll present mainly speak for themselves. I'm going to provide context, identifying the creators of the material for you, but trying not to do too much editorializing, so that you are seeing them and gaining understanding just through the material itself, rather than through my bias. We'll start with Bartholomew Goswald, who we encountered in the previous session. He was the English barrister, explorer, and privateer who was instrumental in founding the Virginia Company in London and Jamestown in America. He led the first recorded European exploration to Cape Cod in 1602. He brought with him a chronicler who documented what they did while they were there for the 5 weeks that they were along the New England coast. This particular line engraving, which was created after Gosnold had been to New England, done in 1634, shows him trading with Wampanoags at Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts. And this is really the first of this type of document that was available, this first picturing of indigenous people of the Northeast. And it shows, and here a little bit of editorializing, it is merely factual. It shows light trading and exchanges between the two peoples. Now, Gosnold and his men regularly met, feasted, bartered with the indigenous people. His chronicler recounts that the atmosphere between the peoples was generally friendly, that the indigenous people were helpful, showing the Englishmen where to find food and other resources. As Archer, which was the name of the chronicler, states, then, after signs of peace and a long speech that one of them made, they came boldly aboard us. They spoke diverse Christian words and seemed to understand much more than we, for want of language, could comprehend. From Goswald, we'll move to Samuel Champlain, who explored Cape Cod in 1605. Now, Champlain was the French explorer, navigator, cartographer, soldier, geographer. He's also an ethnologist, a diplomat, and an extensive chronicler of all that he observed and encountered. He made over 20 trips to the Atlantic coast and founded Quebec and New France. During the summer of 1609, he allied with the Huron, then also known as the Wendat, and the Algonquin tribes in altercations to aid them in their altercations with the Haudenosaunee. He was the first European to really in detail map the New England coastline as well as Lake Champlain. And his maps and his drawings provide, as well as his descriptions, provide a really interesting insight into the country at that time. He writes of Cape Cod in 1605 and the people he encountered. It would seem from their appearance that they have a good disposition, but they are all in fact of no great worth. Even a slight intercourse with them gives you at once a knowledge of them. They are great thieves, and if they cannot lay hold of anything with their hands, they try to do so with their feet. It is necessary to be on one's guard against this people and live in a state of distrust of them, yet without letting them perceive it. In 1613, he drew a wonderful drawing of methods of hunting. And this is a drawing, his depiction of the 1609 altercation between the Huron and the Iroquois. Champlain heroically pictured in the center. Now, reports that Gosnold, Champlain, and many, many others sent back to Europe were widely distributed and publicized. And these reports planted the visions of untapped resources in North America and the potential for great wealth and opportunities. They formed the foundation and the expectations for all subsequent interactions between Indigenous people and the Europeans. William Bradford, the English Puritan separatist, and one of the pilgrims who emigrated first from England and then to the Netherlands, and then finally to establish Plymouth colony in 1620. He served as governor of the Plymouth colony intermittently for about 30 years between 1621 and 1657. And he wrote a journal of Plymouth plantation, which covered the years 1620 to 1646, specifically in Plymouth. In the chapter that is entitled The Lord's Free People, their removal to Leiden, he writes, the place that they, and he's referring to his fellow pilgrims, that they had thoughts on was some of those vast and unpeopled countries of America, which are fruitful and fit for habitation, being devoid of all civil inhabitants, where there are only savage and brutish men, which range up and down, little otherwise than the wild beasts of the same. Now, accompanying Bradford is a gentleman who is unknown to us, but he he compiled a journal in 1622 of goings on and his observations while living in Plymouth. And speaking specifically about encounters with the indigenous people at the time, he writes, they made semblance unto us of friendship and amity. They sang and danced after their manner like antics. Some of them had their faces painted black from the forehead to the chin, 4 or 5 fingers broad, others after other fashions, as they liked. Our messenger made a speech unto him, meaning Massasoit and Quadakina, that King James saluted him with words of love and peace, and did accept of him as his friend and ally, and that our governor desired to see him and to truck with him, and to confirm a peace with him as his next neighbor. And just as a point of reference, truck meaning to trade. Anonymous continues that these people are ill affected towards the English by reason of one Hunt, a master of a ship who deceived the people and got them under color of trucking with them, 20 out of this very place where we inhabit, and 7 men from the Nossets, and carried them away and sold them for slaves like a wretched man, for 20 pound a man, that cares not what mischief he does for his profit. And Anonymous continues, he was a free man in speech, so far as he would express his mind, and of a seemly carriage. The wind beginning to rise a little, we cast a horseman's coat about him, for he was stark naked, only a leather about his waist, with a fringe about a span long, or a little more. He told us that about 4 years ago, all the inhabitants died of an extraordinary plague, and there is neither man, woman, nor child remaining. As indeed we have found none, so as there is none to hinder our possession or lay claim unto it. And he's speaking of Patuxent. Now, in 1629, the official Massachusetts Bay Colony is officially established, and a great seal of that colony is created. And this is that seal that was used from 1629 until 1686, and then just a brief period from 1689 until 1692. And if you look carefully at that seal, and the centerpiece is an Indigenous man holding bow and arrow, with the arrow pointing downward, indicating passivity. And the words coming out of this man's mouth are, "Come over here, come over and help us." Now, John Winthrop, with whom most of us are probably familiar, was the English Puritan separatist who emigrated to Plymouth, who was a founder of the Mass Bay Colony. Winthrop led the first large wave of immigration to the continent of English in 1630. And he brought in his fleet, the Winthrop fleet contained 1,000 colonizers. He served as governor for 12 years, and his history of New England, 1630 to 1649, is also published under Journal of John Winthrop. Governor Winthrop writes, "As for the natives in New England, they enclose no land, neither have any settled habitation, nor any tame cattle to improve the land, and so have no other but a natural right to those countries. So, as if we leave them sufficient to their use, we may lawfully take the rest." Now, Edward Johnson was a member of the Winthrop fleet. He wrote A History of New England from 1628 to 1652. He was a leader in the government of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and he eventually lived in Charleston, and then in 1642 he moved to and helped establish the town of Woburn, Massachusetts Bay Colony. In his History of New England, he writes, "Even about the year 1618, there befell a great mortality among them, the greatest that ever the memory of father to son took notice of, their disease being a sore consumption, sweeping away whole families, but chiefly young men and children. But for this means Christ not only made room for his people to plant, but also tamed the hard and cruel hearts of those barbarous Indians, insomuch that half a handful of his people, landing not long after in Plymouth Plantation, found little resistance." Now, and just interjecting a bit of comment here, what you see is that already in the mid-1600s, we have a narrative appearing that justifies the planting of people, of the English, on the continent. Johnson also writes, in the autumn, 1633, the Indians, who all this time held good correspondence with the English, began to quarrel with them about their bounds of land. But the Lord put an end to this quarrel also by smiting the Indians with a sore disease, even the smallpox, of the which great numbers of them died. Thus did the Lord allay the quarrelsome spirits and made room for the following part of his army. William Wood was an English colonist who lived in Massachusetts Bay Colony from 1629 until 1633. He wrote New England Prospect, a work that includes descriptions of plant life, the geography, the climate, and good descriptions of Native American life and English settlement. In 1634, Wood writes these, and referring to Mohawks, are a cruel, bloody people, which were wont to come down upon their prior neighbors with more than brutish savageness, spoiling their corn, burning their houses, slaying men, ravishing women. Yea, very cannibals they were, sometimes eating on a man, one part after another, before his face and while yet living, insomuch that the very name of a Mohawk would strike the heart of a poor Aborigine dead, were there not hopes at hand of relief from the English to succor them. Edward Winslow was the 3rd, 6th, and 10th governor of Plymouth Colony. With William Bradford, he wrote a relation or journal of the beginning and proceedings of the English plantation settled at Plymouth in New England, which came to be known as Mort's Relation. It was published in 1637. William Bradford contributed the first chapter, and it describes in detail what happened before the landing of the Mayflower and Cape Cod and through their exploring and eventual settling and establishing of Plymouth Colony. Winslow also wrote Good News from New England, a tract that was intended to entice further settlement. According to human reason, guiding only by the light of nature, these people lead the more happy and freer life, being void of care which torments the minds of so many Christians. They are not delighted in baubles, but in useful things. They love not to be encumbered with many utensils, and although every proprietor knows his own, yet all things, so long as they will last, are used in common amongst them. A biscuit cake given to one, that one breaks it equally into so many parts as there be persons in his company, and distributes it. Plato's Commonwealth is so much practiced by these people. It should be noted that as this tract, this journal is being published, the Pequot War is taking place in southern Connecticut colony. Now, scattered throughout the various town records in Massachusetts Bay and Connecticut colonies are references, little snippets of information that help to flesh out the attitudes. One such is found in the Milford, Connecticut town records of 1639. The earth is the Lord's. The earth is given to the saints. We are the saints. David Peterson de Vries was a Dutch navigator, mariner, and patroon for the Dutch West India Company. He established a settlement on Staten Island and another one north of Pavonia that was known as Riesendale. De Vries often acted as a go-between the indigenous people, the Lenape in this case, and the New Netherlands Director General, William Kieft. De Vries famously tried to prevent Kieft from launching the Pavonia Massacre and the massacre at Collier's Hook, which set off the 2-year-long Kieft's War in New Netherlands. Oops. De Vries writes published Voyages from Holland to America, 1632 to 1644, which he wrote after his return to the Netherlands, from notes that he took during his time farming in here. February 20th, 1643, when it was the day the soldiers returned to the fort, having massacred or murdered 80 Indians, and considering they had done a deed of Roman valor in murdering so many in their sleep, where infants were torn from their mothers' breasts and hacked to pieces in the presence of the parents, and the pieces thrown into the fire and in the water, and other sucklings being bound to small boards were cut, stuck, and pierced, and miserably massacred in a manner to move a heart of stone. Some came to our people in the country with their hands, and some with their legs cut off, and some holding their entrails in their arms, and others had such horrible cuts and gashes worse than they were could never happen. De Vries writes, "It is indeed a disgrace to our nation, who have so generous a governor in our fatherland as the Prince of Orange, who had always endeavored in his wars to spill as little blood as possible. As soon as the savages understood that the Swanakens, that is, the Dutch settlers, had so treated them, all the men whom they could surprise on the farmlands they killed. But we have never heard that they ever permitted women or children to be killed. They burned all the houses, farms, barns, grain, haystacks, and destroyed everything they could get their hold of. So there was an open destructive war begun." And this is Keith's war. Roger Williams, the English-born New England Puritan minister, was a theologian and author who founded Providence Plantation. He was a radical Puritan who argued for the complete separation of church and state, and was banished for his beliefs under Massachusetts law. In 1636, he established the settlement at Providence along Narragansett Bay, which became the colony of Rhode Island. Williams advocated for fair dealings with the indigenous people, with the Narragansett people. He studied the language of the New England Native Americans and published the first book-length study of it in English, and that is his key into the language of America. He writes in 1643, "It is a strange truth that a man shall generally find more free entertainment and refreshing amongst these barbarians than amongst thousands that call themselves Christians." Daniel Gookin was a settler, colonizer in Virginia and Massachusetts. He was appointed captain of the train band of Cambridge, and he held that position for 40 years. He was also appointed the first superintendent of the Praying Indians. Those are groups of Massachusetts, villages that were organized by John Eliot, the Reverend John Eliot. And in this capacity, he traveled to a variety of native settlements, often accompanying the Reverend John Eliot. Gookin wrote 2 books on the indigenous people: his historical collections of the Indians in New England, which he completed in 1674, and the doings and sufferings of the Christian Indians, which he completed in 1677. And he comments in his book in 1674 that John Eliot's policy, civilization, and Christianity must go hand in hand. The Indians must be induced to sit down orderly in self-governing villages of their own, apart from the whites, to accept Christian ethics, to take up a more productive agriculture than the wasteful and intermittent efforts of their squaws, to learn carpentry, blacksmithing, and other useful trades, and to be taught their letters that they might read the Bible. The main design of the English was to bring them to the good knowledge of God in Christ Jesus, and to suppress among them those sins of drunkenness, idolatry, powwowing, or witchcraft, whoredom, murder, and like sins. In 1674, he accompanies John Eliot on Eliot's final travels, visiting all of the praying villages, and those are in Massachusetts, and there are three located in Northeast Connecticut. On the 16th of September, as Gookin says, being at Wabquisset, which is present-day Woodstock, Connecticut, as soon as the people were come together, Mr. Eliot first prayed, and then preached to them in their own language. And then I began a court among the Indians. And first I approved their teacher, Sampson, and their constable, Black James. And then I published a warrant or order that I prepared, empowering the constable to suppress drunkenness, Sabbath breaking, especially powwowing and idolatry, and after warning given, to apprehend all delinquents and bring them before authority to answer for their misdoings. The smaller faults to bring before Watasakampanum, ruler of the Nipmuc country, for idolatry and powwowing, to bring them before me. Now, the period 1675, just following Eliot and Gookin's travels to the praying towns, 1675 through 1676 marks King Philip's War. Mary Rowlandson was one of the women captured during a raid in King Philip's War. She was taken from Lancaster, Massachusetts. On the 10th of February, 1675, came the Indians in great numbers upon Lancaster. Thus, these murderous wretches went on, burning and destroying before them. Out we must go, the fire increasing and coming along behind us, roaring, and the Indians gaping before us with their guns, spears, and hatchets to devour us. Thus were we butchered by those merciless heathen. It is a solemn sight to see so many Christians lying in their blood, some here and some there, like a company of sheep torn by wolves, ranting and insulting, as if they would have torn our very hearts out. This is just one of the passages from Mary Rowlandson's A History of the Captivity and Restoration of Mrs. Mary Rowlandson, a minister's wife in New England, that she published in 1682. And it begins the genre of captivity narratives, especially women's captivity narratives, and it establishes the tone for those narratives that only become more and more inflammatory and more surprising and appalling with each new publication. Mary Rowlandson writes of the first movement away from Lancaster as she's captive. This was the dolefullest night that ever my eyes saw. Oh, the roaring and singing and dancing and yelling of those black creatures in the night, which made the place a lively resemblance of hell. That same year, Springfield, the colony in Massachusetts, is attacked and burned. And as we see from the Springfield town records, on the 7th of October in the year 1675, a day to be kept in memory by posterity, when the barbarous heathen made an assault on this poor town, killed 2 men and a woman, and wounded several, one of which died long after. Burned down 20 dwelling houses and barns, much corn and hay, but God did wonderfully preserve us, or we had been a prey to their teeth. God in his good providence so ordered it. that an Indian gave intelligence of the enemy's design to fall on this town, whereby we escaped with our lives, by which we should give God the glory. This is an eyewitness account or retelling by Jonathan Burt, entered into the Springfield Town Records. Excuse me, let me go back. And Benjamin Thompson was an American Puritan, a poet, an author, an educator, and a physician in Massachusetts Bay Colony. Well, he's noted for his poetry and his writings that involved about King Philip's War and related conflicts between the colonies and Massachusetts indigenous people in the 17th century. He wrote New England Crisis in 1676 at the height of King Philip's War. Here might be seen the smoking funeral piles of wildered towns pitched distant many miles. Here might be seen the infant from the breast snatched by a pagan hand to lasting rest. The mother Rachel-like shrieks out, "My child!" She wrings her hands and raves as she were wild. The brutish wolves suppress her anxious moan by cruelties more deadly of her own. From farms to farms, from towns to towns they post. They strip, they bind, they ravish, flee, and roast. His poetry became extraordinarily popular, setting the tone for subsequent poets throughout the colonies. William Penn was an English writer, religious thinker, and influential Quaker who founded the province of Pennsylvania in 1681. Penn was an advocate of democracy and religious freedom, known for his amicable relations and successful treaties with the Lenape people. He published in 1683 an advertisement in England, and it was designed, it's called The Description of Pennsylvania, and it was designed quite specifically to entice further men, women, and children to come to Pennsylvania to settle. He writes of the natives or aborigines in chapter 12, their language is lofty, yet narrow, but like the Hebrew, in signification full, like shorthand in writing. One word serveth in the place of three, and the rest are supplied by the understanding of the hearer. And I must say that I know not a language spoken in Europe that has words of more sweetness or greatness in accent and emphasis than theirs. He further writes, but in liberality they excel. Nothing is too good for their friends. Give them a fine gun, coat, or other thing. It may pass 20 hands before it sticks. Light of heart, strong affections, but soon spent, the most merry creatures that live, feast, and dance perpetually. They never have much, nor want much. Wealth circulateth like the blood. All parts partake, though none shall want what another hath, yet exact observers of property. And finally, in chapter 21, these poor people are under a dark night in things relating to religion, to be sure, the tradition of it. Yet they believe a God and immortality without the help of metaphysics. For they say there is a great king that made them, who dwells in a glorious country to the southward of them, and that the souls of the good shall go thither, where they shall live again. Now, Thomas Campanius Holm is a Swedish colonizer who settled in New Sweden, which is in the Delaware region. He's author of the description of the province of New Sweden, now called by the English Delaware in Pennsylvania. And he published now New Sweden was founded in 1638. He arrives in the late 1600s. And he describes the Lenape people. The American Indians are tall, strong, nimble, and their limbs are well proportioned. They have broad faces, small black eyes, flat noses, large lips, short, broad teeth, but very white. They have no beard. Their hair is black and straight. They cut it short, except a small tuft at the top of the head. Their color is not entirely black, but brown or yellowish. They wear no clothes, but go generally naked. For that reason, they anoint themselves with bear's grease and a kind of black paint which they find on the seashore, that their bodies may endure better the heat of the sun. As to moral qualities, these Americans are cute and ingenious after their manner. For although they are in darkness with regard to religious subjects and other intricate knowledge, yet they are very sagacious in matters of business and easily imitate what they see the Christians do when it can be of use to them. And they can make the instruments which the Swedes use, sometimes neater and better than the Swedes themselves. These Indians are the most sensible nation in all America and are particularly well disposed towards the Christian religion. As to their manners and customs, they have greatly changed since the Swedes first came among them. It has been observed and been a subject of regret that they have learned many vices by their intercourse with the Christians, particularly drunkenness, which was before unknown to them, as they drank nothing but pure water. And also in 1702, otherwise there is no difficulty in the intercourse with these barbarians. When they are not offended, they are honest, good-hearted people, and will even expose themselves to death for those for whom they profess friendship. Now, at the same time that Holm is publishing his work, Cotton Mather is publishing the Magnalia Christi Americana, a voluminous description of America at the beginning of the 1700s. Mather is a New England Puritan clergyman, theologian, and writer. He began his education at Harvard University when he was just 12 years old. He becomes minister in 1685 of the Congregational Old North Meeting House of Boston, and he preached there for the rest of his life. He's remembered as one of the most influential Puritan ministers of his day and was considered one of the most influential figures in early America. He's also known for helping to lead the successful revolt of 1689 against Governor Andros, and for his involvement in the Salem witch trials, 1692 to 1693. But again, in 1702, he publishes the Magnalia Christi Americana. And in his descriptions of the indigenous people, he writes, the natives of the country now possessed by the New Englanders have been forlorn and wretched heathen ever since their first herding here. And though we know not when or how those Indians first became inhabitants of this mighty continent, yet we may guess that probably the devil decoyed those miserable savages hither in hopes that the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ would never come here to destroy or disturb his absolute empire over them. He writes, now and then, these doleful creatures are the veriest, now then, These doleful creatures are the veriest ruins of mankind, which are to be found anywhere upon the face of the earth. These abject creatures live in a country full of mines. We have already made entrance upon our iron, and in the very surface of the ground among us, it is thought that there lies copper enough to supply all this world, besides other mines hereafter to be exposed. But our shiftless Indians were never owners of so much as a knife till we come along. And speaking again of the indigenous people, they live in a country where we now have all the conveniences of human life. But as for them, their housing is nothing but a few mats tied around poles, fastened in the earth, or a good fire is their bedclothes in the coldest season. They live in a country full of the best ship timber under heaven, but never saw a ship till some came from Europe hither. And then they were scared out of their wits to see the monster come sailing in and spitting fire with a mighty noise out of her floating side. Their way of living is infinitely barbarous. The men are most abominably slothful, making their poor squaws or wives to plant and dress and barn and beat their corn and build their wigwams for them. No arts are understood among them, except just so far as to maintain their brutish conversation, which is little more than is to be found among the very beavers upon our streams. And of John Eliot's efforts, Cotton Mather writes, "This was the miserable people which our Eliot propounded unto himself to teach and save. And he had a double work incumbent on him. He was to make men of them, ere he could hope to see them saints. They must be civilized ere they could be Christianized. To think on raising a number of these hideous creatures unto the elevations of our holy religion must argue more than common or little sentiments in the undertaker." Michel Guillaume Jean de Crevecoeur was a French-American author, diplomat, and farmer who published a volume of narrative essays that he titled Letters from an American Farmer in 1782. The book quickly became the first literary success by an American author in Europe. He was the first author to describe to Europeans the life on the American frontier, including the indigenous people. Crevecoeur writes, "Without temples, without priests, without kings, and without laws, they are in many instances superior to us. And the proofs of what I advance are that they live without care, sleep without inquietude, take life as it comes, bearing all its asperities with unparalleled patience, and die without any kind of apprehension for what they have done or for what they expect to meet with hereafter. What system of philosophy can give us so many necessary qualifications for happiness? They most certainly are much more closer connected with nature than we are, and they are her immediate children. The inhabitants of the woods are her undefiled offspring." And finally, we have Benjamin Franklin, who in 1784 writes concerning the American savages. "Savages we call them, because their manners differ from ours, which we think the perfection of civility. They think the same of theirs. The Indian men when young are hunters and warriors, when old, counselors. For all of their government is by counsel of the sages. The Indian women till the ground, dress the food, nurse and bring up children, and preserve and hand down to posterity the memory of public transactions. The business of women is to take exact notice of what passes, imprint it in their memories, for they have no writings, and communicate it to their children. They are the records of the council, and they preserve traditions of the stipulations in treaties 100 years back. And commenting upon the conduct of the indigenous people, Franklin writes, to interrupt another, even in conversation, is reckoned highly indecent. How different this is from the conduct of polite British House of Commons, and from the mode of conversation in many polite companies of Europe, where, if you do not deliver your sentence with great rapidity, you are cut off in the middle of it by the impatient loquacity of those you converse with, and never suffered to finish it. And, oops, sorry. And Ben Franklin describes a conversation he had with Conrad Weiser, who was a Pennsylvania Indian agent and trader. And in that conversation, Weiser recounts his discussion with Canasatego, who was a native man that he spoke with frequently. And according to Franklin, the Canasatego said to Weiser, if a white man traveling through our country enters one of our cabins, we all treat him as I treat you. We dry him if he is wet. We warm him if he is cold. We give him meat and drink, that he may allay his thirst and hunger. And we spread soft furs for him to rest and sleep on. We demand nothing in return. But if I go into a white man's house at Albany and ask for victuals and drink, they say, where is your money? And if I have none, they say, get out, you Indian dog. You see, they have not yet learned those little good things that we need no meetings to be instructed in, because our mothers taught them to us when we were children. And that's just a sampling of the interesting documents that enlighten us on the differing perspectives of the Europeans during this period, 1600 to 1780. And just take a couple of minutes and run through some paintings and prints, because then there were the visuals that were prepared. This is Ninigret, who was a Lenape sachem. This was painted in 1700 rather, and it's believed to be the first true portrait done of an indigenous person. Ninigret was allied with colonists and the Narragansetts against the Pequots. This is the famous Four Indian Kings done in 1710 by John Barris. They were Haudenosaunee sachems who were persuaded to travel to England. The intent of their trip was that they would reinforce and advocate for Massachusetts Bay Colony to attack Quebec in the early 1700s. They are from left to right: Sagaith Quapithto, who was king of the Maquas; Honeyith Noro, king of Ganadaris; Tihinin Hogaro, emperor of the Six Nations; Anita Ocom, king of the River Nation, the Mohegan. Now, the portraits were done at the request of Queen Anne. These individuals were presented at court and caused such a sensation. They were immediately popularized, and the portraits were publicized all over Europe, reproduced as prints and as engravings. This is Lapawinso, done by Gustavus Helius in Philadelphia in 1735. Lapawinso was a Lenape sachem who sold the land of his tribe to Thomas and John Penn, the sons of William Penn. There were lots of sketches and watercolors and drawings done casually rather than formally by the men and perhaps women also who were moving about through the interiors and encountering indigenous people. This is an Iroquois, titled An Iroquois Woman. It was done at least mid-18th century. The artist is unknown. In the City of Montreal archives, we have this wonderful sketch of Abenakis and an Abenaki, that is Abenaki woman and man, again, an unknown artist from the mid-18th century. It is joined by this labeled Algonquin and Algonquin, woman and man. Artist, again, unknown, mid-18th century. There was a fascination throughout the colonies with the notion of scalping, with the ferocity of indigenous warriors. The top is an Indian war chief equipped with a scalp in his hand, done by George Townsend, the 4th Viscount and 1st Marquis of Townsend in the 1750s. And beneath it, an Iroquois warrior with more than one scalp hanging from his musket. Again, artist unknown, mid-18th century. We have Anthony Walker's engraving in 1760 of the Mohawk Indian warrior with his tom axe and scalping knife. And Paul Revere, who in 1772 published this engraving of King Philip of Mount Hope. Grasset Saint-Sauveur in Paris, following his travels throughout the continent in 1787, published these two watercolors, the Grand Chef de Guerrero Iroquois and the Guerrero de Iroquois. And there's a continuing fascination through the 1700s with the exotic of the indigenous people, regardless of whether they are wearing more European clothing or not. And these two watercolors certainly point that up. And we'll finish with Joseph Brant, known as Tyendinaga. He allied himself, he was a Mohawk sachem who allied himself with the British during the American Revolutionary War. This was a painting done by Gilbert Stuart when he visited London in 1786. And then Charles Wilson Peale painted him in 1797. Just some examples of the artwork that is available that also provides us with information on how the Europeans viewed in New England's indigenous people. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Gail. I want to remind attendees that if they'd like to put questions in the Q&A, which I see one from Julie, which I'll read in a minute, please do so. And also you can use the chat feature. Julie asks or states, she's seen, rather than, quote, artist unknown, end quote, the recognition that the artists were, quote, once known, end quote. Do you have a response to that?
That's probably true. That's a good, that the name of the artist has not come down to us through history, but that's a reasonable observation.
I was going to ask maybe one of the significant European writings about indigenous peoples probably around the world, but maybe your thoughts about the papal proclamations or bulls that were made about indigenous peoples.
Well, because they had such influence, they influence amongst the Catholic world, particularly in Canada, then they were certainly significant. I deliberately stayed away from, for this particular talk, the accounts by the Canadian explorers, as well as accounts and descriptions from the Jesuit priests, and they are equally as voluminous as the English.
We have another question here. Your work shows that there was disagreement amongst Europeans about how to treat indigenous people. Why do you think Europeans ultimately opted for conquest instead of cooperation?
Well, let's see. That's a topic for prolonged discussion. My short answer is that the basic philosophy coming out of Europe was one could describe it as the conquistador philosophy. It was of conquest and entitlement. And the majority of people who came to North America from Europe were coming to enrich themselves in one way or another, to take advantage of the natural resources. And as we saw from many of the writings, they felt entitled to the land, and they felt that they gave no value or little value to the inhabitants, other than as potentials for enslavement, or as obstacles that stood in their way. And I think this was the mindset of the majority of the European adventurers, entrepreneurs, and merchants who came to North America.
Michael Kerr writes, though presumably the early colonists were largely Protestants, was there any invocation of papal decrees with respect to terra nullius, doctrine of discovery, and the like in the civilizing and Christianizing project and process?
There was a pretty significant division between Catholicism and Protestantism. What one observes a similarity in belief in the beliefs that both religions held, in that this was a virgin land, and a land that as we saw from the Milford Town records, that the earth is for the saints and we are the saints. There were Catholics certainly who settled in many places in the colonies, particularly in as the southern colonies were being established, and so that the papal bulls, that declaration would adhere and support the activities in those colonies.
Dean Johnson asks, in the last episode, the Atlantic cod, the fish, was identified as a reason for European explorers to come to the North American coast, but no mention of timber needed for European ship mass. I was wondering if timber was an interest that surfaced with this next stage of settlers coming, or is it European seeking timber in North America a myth?
Oh, they absolutely did, and you're right in your observation. Cod was the beginning, but then once that that the reports that are going back being sent back by the fishermen and the early explorers are hinting at the potential, the timber, the potential for minerals, unknown minerals, as I think I've said, untold wealth. It's being sold. The continent is being sold as this virgin territory that has unlimited potential for wealth. And it's the cod, and then it goes to the beaver for the fur trade, because that was the trend, the fashion trend at the time in Europe. But timber is right there. Timber is one of the next big resources, and at the same time as we in the 1600s, as we're seeing the fur trade exploding, one of the secondary industries, if you would, is the timber industry, and a significant amount of forest is being identified as the king's timber. That is, these are old growth woods that have produced the timber that is suitable for the masts of the ships. And so you are absolutely right that timber is, as well as all minerals, are two of the things I guess I would say it's the third wave of resources that comes under exploitation by European moneymen.
Now it looks like we've had a pause in the questions. Would you have any closing thoughts?
Yes, there are probably hundreds, thousands of documents that were generated during this period, that by Europeans on interactions with indigenous people, on their observations of indigenous people. The whole genre of captivity narratives is something on itself altogether. And the variety, the range of perspectives becomes evident the more that you read. And even though the overarching perspective is one of entitlement, and is one of disdain and dismissal, and of aggression, there are sprinkled here and there, as I sprinkled into my presentation, people who come at it, Europeans who come at their encounters with the indigenous people with more open eyes, without all of the bias that one would find in, say, a Cotton Mather or a Daniel Gookin, as two examples. And it's really worth reading through them, any that you can find, to help you to understand better the perspective of the European colonizers. And then read a few of the captivity narratives with this perspective in mind.
We have a comment. Thinking of early Black members of European explorer parties, are there any writings reflective of their particular perspectives or observations? And
I have not seen any, but that doesn't mean there aren't any. And someone in the audience may know of one, although it's very possible that because of the position of Black sailors in society, that they may not have been in a position to be able to document their observations either. But as I said, there isn't a year that goes by, a month that goes by, that I don't read another trove of documents that I hadn't known existed, that provides me with new information and new perspective. So it's very possible that there is something out there. I just haven't seen it as yet. I haven't noted it, that I've noted that I've seen it as yet.
And then we have, often it seems that the conquerors or occupiers end up marrying indigenous women. Any thoughts on why this doesn't seem to have happened often in New England?
It had to do with the religious conventions of the time. It was frowned upon. It was really not permitted. But you certainly see that wasn't the case in French Canada at all. And as you get farther and farther, as the time period extends and you get farther and farther toward the front, at the frontier expands, and the population is not as the congregational Puritan religion is not as is loosening its restrictions a little bit. It's loosening its hold on the population, and there's a greater mix of people with varying levels of religiosity. Then you see that happening, that it increases in English colonized North America. So if we talk about the period of the 7 Years' War and in through the period of the Revolutionary War, there are, along the frontier, there are more relationships like that.
I was going to ask, with later writers, European or now American writers, say for instance, Longfellow, for example, in Hiawatha, and the writings that would happen, it's a whole different thing. It's almost a romanticization. Could you comment a little bit about that?
No.
Okay.
No, it's the 19th. I
19th century.
I do not dive into that 19th century literature.
Okay.
I haven't had the time to, nor probably the bandwidth to unpack that particular, the 19th century moral attitudes that gave rise to that.
Very good. Okay, so I will make a last call. Any last questions, or do you want to have the last word before we end for the evening?
I thank you all for your attention, and if you have any further questions or comments or information to share, I am always looking for new material. So, please don't hesitate. You can send it to Andy and he'll forward it to me. And
we will send out a survey. So hopefully people will respond to that, and I share that.
Please do. The surveys, I don't necessarily love to do surveys all the time, but I certainly love to read surveys because it helps inform me on ways to improve my presentations.
Well, have a good night, Gail. Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone. And we'll see you next month.
Yes. Thank you all.